All right, a few disclaimers before this video begins. I'm obviously not memorized. There's no part of me that could have memorized a 20-ish minute long speech about masculinity and school shootings. Second, I'm filming this in parts, chunk by section of my essay. So if there's cutting, that's why. And also, this video is powered by Diet Coke. Growing up in the age of YouTube and Twitter, I had the entire world in the palm of my dirty, sticky iPad kid hands. Now, I remember one day scrolling on Twitter, which my mom didn't know I had on my brother and I's shared iPod Touch, and I came across a comment saying something along the lines of, "Don't show up to school the day after you make fun of the quiet kid." As an elementary school student, I didn't really have the comprehension skills to understand what that meant. So I asked my mom, and she went quiet and told me that she didn't want to talk to me about that. Of course, being curious, I chose to dive deeper. I looked it up and found out that it was a joke about school shootings. And that's where my curiosity grew into something much larger: fear. I became terrified of the idea that somebody would do the same thing to my school. But that didn't stop me from learning everything I could about the most famous school shootings. Now, that may seem like an odd hyperfixation for a fifth grader to have, and you're probably right. But my mom not wanting to talk about these things led me to have such intense curiosity that I couldn't stop myself. I later found out that my mom had been teaching in the Columbine School District when the Columbine High School shooting happened, so talking about school shootings was difficult for her, understandably so. I continued to learn and continued to be curious about them, as my mom continued to be silent about her experiences. But today, let's talk about them. Across the last 10 years, one question has stuck out in my mind. What drives the shooters to commit these acts, and why do they all seem to be men? While school shootings in the United States tragically seem to be recurring and never-ending, the mainstream conversation often overlooks one critical factor: masculinity. Specifically, we're talking about hegemonic masculinity. This isn't just about being a man, it's about a narrow cultural idea of what being a man should look like, where dominance, aggression, and a stoic, almost emotionless toughness reign supreme. So why does this matter in the context of school shootings? Well, when we look at the profile of many school shooters, there's often a common thread. These young men aren't just angry, they are products of a culture that equates manhood with violence. Mix in America's unique gun culture, where firearms aren't just tools for hunting or self-defense, but are glorified as symbols of masculinity and power, and you've got a recipe for disaster. Guns become the ultimate expression of dominance, a way to regain control, to be the man. So in this video essay, we'll unravel how masculinity, the kind that glorifies aggression and makes men feel like they have to suppress their emotions, plays a huge role in fueling the violence of school shootings. And we'll see how guns become a prop in the performance of manhood, deepening the connection between masculinity and violence in the United States. So let's talk masculinity, but not in the men are from Mars kind of way. We're talking about hegemonic masculinity, a fancy term for the type of masculinity that society loves to prop up. Think dominance, aggression, emotional repression, and power. I mean, it's not just that this version of manhood exists, but that it is actively reinforced everywhere, from locker room banter to superhero movies to even how schools function. But what exactly is hegemonic masculinity? Well, it's the idea that real men are tough, aggressive, and always in control. Dr. Richard Evans, in his work for Carleton University on teenage masculinity and school shootings, breaks it down. He explains how this ideal isn't just something boys pick up on their own. It's ingrained from the start. Boys are told to man up if they show too much emotion, while power and dominance are treated as the ultimate goals. This isn't just a personal preference, it's socially constructed and reinforced by peers, media, and even our institutions. And this becomes even clearer when we look at the social hierarchies inside schools. Sandy Watson's article, Reaping What We Sow, really gets into how schools create and maintain masculine hierarchies. The ones who dominate sports, nail the confidence game, or keep their emotions in check, climb to the top. I mean, my senior year of high school, the men picked for homecoming court weren't really the nicest or the funniest, but they were the most manly, domineering guys. They weren't necessarily bad, but they fit the bill for what a man should be. So those boys are boosted above the others. But what happens to the ones who don't fit the mold? For those who don't, whether they're not aggressive enough, too emotional, or socially excluded, the pressure to measure up can be overwhelming. This failure to meet masculine ideas often leaves boys feeling emasculated and frustrated, and that frustration can turn into something much darker. If unchecked, those feelings can build up until they explode into violent behavior, which sometimes leads to tragic outcomes, like school shootings. By unpacking this, we start to see that masculinity isn't just something that you are, it's something that you are constantly performing. And failing that performance in a society obsessed with power and men has real and sometimes deadly outcomes. So, diving into the uncomfortable reality of how violence and masculinity are tied together, we can look at how this connection plays out in specifically school shootings. Here's the thing. Society has these deeply ingrained expectations about how men should respond to conflict. And the loudest message that boys and men hear is that when things get tough, they should use aggression. From the time boys are young, there is a cultural script that teaches them to equate conflict with violence. They're told to be tough, fight back, and never show weakness. This is part of the hegemonic masculinity we talked about earlier. Real men don't just talk things out. They assert their dominance with violence. Media constantly depicts men as inherently violent. Whether it's action heroes or video games, this narrative of the manly, violent man normalizes aggression, making boys feel like it's their natural response to a threat. But here's where it gets even darker. The concept of masculinity threat. When a guy feels like his masculinity is being questioned or challenged, it can trigger intense feelings of inadequacy. In the interdisciplinary journal Homicide Studies, Skylar Morgan and Allison Klein coined this idea in the article Strained Masculinity and Mass Shootings. This is where perceived emasculation, the idea that someone is stripping away your manhood, leads to violent retribution. For some, it's not just about being insulted or bullied, it's about feeling their entire identity as a man is under attack. And in environments like schools, where social hierarchies are brutal and constantly shifting, the pressure to prove your masculinity can be crushing. It is also crucial to recognize that race can play a significant role in these incidents as well, with many shooters being white males, who often have a perception of themselves as entitled to certain privileges, including social dominance and control. And honestly, it's not just that these white men believe they have privilege. They do have certain privileges that people of color simply do not, like the privilege of being individually held accountable. I'll explain. When white shooters carry out mass violence, their behavior is often framed as an individual crisis, a troubled individual, distancing their actions from their racial identity. In contrast, when shooters are people of color, their race is often highlighted as part of their racial narrative. This disparity reinforces the social dominance that many white male shooters may already feel entitled to, which is why most school shooters are men. White shooters are seen as individuals, while minority shooters are portrayed as a representative of their entire race. We can examine how this white privilege has manifested itself in real circumstances. Sociology professors William Mangus and Bradley Zoff explore this in their dissertation, White Means Never Having to Say You're Sorry, by comparing shootings by a white perpetrator and a non-white perpetrator. April 16, 2007. A man entered Virginia Tech and opened fire during classes, using 2 handguns and firing over 200 rounds. He killed 32 people, wounded many others, and ultimately took his own life. The shooter was identified as Sung Hoi Cho, a Korean-born U.S. permanent resident and a VTech student. In response, a Korean official apologized on behalf of Koreans, citing a collective guilt for the shooting. February 14, 2008, less than a year after Virginia Tech, a man entered Northern Illinois University, armed with a shotgun and 3 handguns. He fired 6 shots with the shotgun and 48 with the handguns, killing 6 students and injuring 18 others before taking his own life. The shooter, Stephen Kazmierzak, like most school shooters, was white. No public apology, like the Korean public statement, with an apology on behalf of white people, was issued. To identify these two facets of school shooters, let's look at Dylan Klebold and Eric Harris, the young men behind the Columbine massacre, as an example of both the masculinity threat and the concept of white privilege when it comes to school shootings. Now, these two young men embodied many of the traits associated with masculinity threat. They felt rejected, whether because of their social status, their physical appearance, or simply because they couldn't fit the mold of what society tells men they should be. In their minds, their violence became a way to assert their masculinity in a world where they felt they had none. Looking specifically at the shooting of 1999 in Columbine, we can also address the racialization of this massacre. Because the shooters were both white and only one of the victims was African American, race was quickly dismissed as a relevant factor as to why these shooters committed the act. Professors Audrey Kobayashi and Linda Peake, in their piece on whiteness, actually argue that race is an important factor, because the massacre occurred in a predominantly white town, in a predominantly white school, by shooters who were themselves white. Dylan and Eric's massacre is a racial issue, because their whiteness allowed them to be just two troubled kids, while shooters of color were and are forced to be representatives of their racial group as a whole. Now, this privilege reflects a broader pattern of white supremacy shaping the narrative and aftermath of mass shootings. Shooters like Harris and Klebold and the NIU shooter are rarely labeled as terrorists, and their actions are frequently attributed to their mental illness or personal struggle. However, when shooters are from minority groups, such as Cho from Virginia Tech, the media and public discourse emphasize their racial identity, which leads to intense racial scapegoating. In these cases, white shooters are seen as the outliers, the troubled, and shooters of color become symbols of a larger racial threat. This differential treatment reveals how deeply white privilege is embedded in the way America understands violence. So when we talk about school shootings, it isn't just about mental health or gun access, though those do play a huge role. But there's also a toxic undercurrent of masculinity and white privilege. It's this idea that if men can't be strong, dominant, and aggressive in the way society expects, they're failures. And because of their whiteness, they have the privilege to lash out and blame it on their struggles. It's not an excuse for violence, but it is a piece of the sociological puzzle that we must address when we have conversations about these cycles of school shootings. Now, let's talk about one of the most iconic symbols of masculinity in America: guns. This phenomenon is centralized in the US and unique to our American culture. In the United States, guns aren't just tools for hunting or self-defense. They're deeply tied to this idea of what it means to be a real man. It's not a coincidence that gun ownership is often marketed as a pathway to reclaiming power, control, and most importantly, masculinity. Think about it. So many ads and movies push the image of a rugged, tough guy with a gun, standing up to danger, protecting his family, and defending his honor. Gun culture in the US has tapped into this very specific idea of manhood, where owning a gun means that you're strong, in control, and don't need anyone else to protect you. It's almost like a shortcut to masculinity. You don't feel power? Buy a gun. And advertising companies know exactly what they're doing with this messaging. I mean, if you've ever seen one of those hyper-masculine gun ads, you know what I'm talking about. There are even early ad campaigns for guns that include a father and his young son sharing it. The messaging of guns being a symbol for men is clear. But it's not just about marketing. For a lot of young men, particularly those who feel marginalized, whether they're being bullied, socially rejected, or just don't feel like they fit in, guns become a way to reclaim power. Adam Lanza, the Sandy Hook shooter, had been going to the shooting range with his mother from a young age, and it's assumed that he loved guns. They made him feel powerful. When you're feeling powerless, a gun can seem like the ultimate tool to take that power back. It is a tangible way to feel strong in a world where you might otherwise feel weak. And for some, that feeling of power is intoxicating. It's almost like a high. And that's where it starts to get dangerous. When a guy feels emasculated with the concept of our masculinity threat, maybe he's been bullied, excluded, or rejected, he might turn to a gun to prove his masculinity. Gun culture tells that young boy that owning and using a gun is how you show the world you're in charge. And in the most tragic cases, that can lead to violence. For those boys, gun violence isn't just an act of aggression. It's a way to assert dominance, to take back the power that they have lost. This is why gun culture and masculinity are so deeply intertwined. For some young men, guns become the answer to emasculation. Violence becomes their way of proving their manhood. It's not about the gun itself. It's what the gun represents: power, masculinity, and control. Next, we're going to talk about schools, the place where a lot of us spend years navigating social hierarchies, figuring out where we fit, and unfortunately, where many of these harmful masculine ideals are constantly reinforced. Now, schools aren't neutral spaces where everyone is equal. They're breeding grounds for masculine hierarchies, and they shape how boys see themselves and others based on these outdated ideas that we've talked about of what it means to be a man. Here's the thing. Schools are gendered spaces, whether we realize it or not. Think about it. Whether in the classroom or on the football field or in after-school activities, there's always this unspoken competition among boys. Who's the most popular? Who's the leader? Boys are constantly pushed to prove themselves through dominance, strength, and the ability to fit into the box of hegemonic masculinity. Not only do these hierarchies pit boys against each other, but they also create friction between boys and their teachers, many of whom are women. Female teachers as authority figures can be perceived as a threat to the fragile sense of masculinity that young men feel pressured to uphold. So being disciplined or corrected by women can heighten their feelings of emasculation, feeding the already present frustration that some boys feel when they aren't meeting the social expectations of manhood. And if you're on the margins of the hierarchy, maybe you're not athletic, not aggressive, or you don't fit into the social mold, you're likely facing bullying or social rejection. Evans breaks this down in his research dissertation earlier mentioned in this video, showing that boys who don't live up to this rigid ideal are often excluded or ostracized. They become targets. This daily rejection and humiliation fuels frustration and anger. Day in and day out, they're told, "You're not enough." This is where things can get dangerous. Social rejection, bullying, and the feeling of not being man enough can push some young men into a desperate state, where violence is their last-ditch effort to reclaim control. Now, when we talk about how social rejection often influences school shootings, I want to make it clear that I'm not saying that violence doesn't exist outside of socially othered men. Toxic, hegemonic masculinity and violence is present in all groups of men, regardless of whether they're socially accepted or not. However, when we talk about the demographics of the young men who commit school shootings, it is most often men who were otherwise excluded or ostracized. So that's why this is important to note. The social rejection that these men experience is where school shootings come into play. Skylar Morgan, in his aforementioned analysis of male shooters, points out that many of these young men were socially isolated, humiliated, and pushed to the margins of the hierarchies. They weren't just loners by choice. They were rejected, and that rejection fueled their desire for violent retribution. For them, committing acts of violence, like school shootings, became a twisted way of reclaiming their masculine status. They believed that through violence, they could finally assert the control that had been taken away from them. So let's dive into how sociological theories help us understand this messy intersection between masculinity and violence, especially in the context of school shootings. It's not just about individual choices. There are bigger forces at play here. Now, first up is Robert Merton's strain theory. Now, Merton's strain theory basically says that when people are pushed to achieve certain societal goals, but don't have the means to achieve them, that gap creates strain. It's like the pressure cooker effect. When you're expected to be something, in this case the ideal man, but you can't meet those expectations, it builds up frustration. For young men in school, the strain to hit those masculine milestones, being popular, strong, dominant, and academically successful, can be overwhelming. Now, for some, the release of that strain can be violent. When society tells boys that they should be powerful, in control, and successful, but they're constantly facing rejection or failure, some turn to violence as a twisted way of reclaiming that power. It's not that these men always want to be violent necessarily, but in their minds, it's that final attempt to assert the masculinity they have been told they lack. Watson's work digs into this by showing how young men in schools who can't live up to these masculine ideals often feel an intense strain, and that can lead to violent actions when all other avenues feel closed off. But at this point, we have discussed at length how these men are, at least in their mind, forced into the position where violence is all they have left. So, let's look at a different perspective of how the mindset of using violence to fix problems was created using social learning theory. In layman's terms, this theory states that we learn behavior from the people and the media around us. It's like that phrase, monkey see, monkey do. But in this case, it's a lot darker. From a young age, boys are absorbing messages about what it means to be a man. From the media they consume to their families, their friends, movies, and more. And the one that keeps coming up in that media, and in this video, violence as a solution. We see it in action movies, video games, and even the news. Aggression and violence is often depicted as a legitimate way to handle conflict or prove one's strength. Now, since they're not learning how to express their emotions in healthy ways, they are learning that aggression and violence are acceptable ways to handle their problems, especially if it threatens their masculinity. Communication studies professor Mia Consalvo, in their piece The Monsters Next Door, talks about how boys repeatedly see violence as the go-to method for resolving trouble, and it becomes ingrained in their psyche. The more they see it, the more they believe it's the right or only way to respond, especially when they feel cornered. And when we look at school shootings through these lenses, it's not just about a couple of bad apples or disturbed individuals. It's about understanding how societal pressures around masculinity can push young men who feel powerless or rejected into seeing violence as their only way out. Alright, so at the heart of this video exploration, we've been looking at how masculinity, specifically the way it is socially constructed, plays a huge role in shaping the motivations behind school shootings. It's not just about individual shooters or their personal grievances. It's about the larger cultural pressures we place on boys to be dominant, aggressive, and emotionally closed off. We looked critically at how schools, as gendered spaces, are pushing kids into positions that perpetuate this type of violence, and how young white men are fueled by their white male privilege to commit acts of mass murder due to their misunderstanding of racial responsibility. When these ideals of being a strong, superior, young white man aren't met, especially in environments like school, where masculinity is constantly being tested, some boys feel mass violence is the only way to get that power back. Now, the point here isn't to provide a neat and tidy solution, because there isn't one. This isn't a problem that can be solved by just addressing social and hierarchical insecurity or mental health in isolation. It's about understanding how gender norms, mental health, social rejection, and the glorification of violence all come together to create an environment that breeds tragedies like school shootings. And that means that future conversations about these acts need to be a lot more nuanced. What we can do is start looking at these factors more critically and through a sociological lens. If we want to better understand and address the issue of school shootings, we need to critically examine the intersection between manhood, power, and violence, because the cost of ignoring this link is far too high. Version of manhood exists, but that it is actively enforced. Okay, never mind. I'm gonna be really annoying to them. I have to talk for like a full 20 minutes. That's asleep. And there are people talking outside the door. This is embarrassing. To identify. I just went through that whole thing and wasn't filming. That is crazy. That is crazy. Tyler Morgan, in his aforementioned analysis of male Okay. But at this point, we have discussed at length how... This just made everything worse. It's Professor Mia Consalvo in their piece, The Monster Next Door. I'm so close to being done. Everything needs to stop. Okay. Ugh. Thanks for watching.